If you have a Bible, please open it to Leviticus chapter 11, please. Leviticus chapter 11. We have made good headway now into an extended teaching series through the book of Leviticus. Today we begin what you might call part 3 of the series. If you were to divide Leviticus up into its major movements or sections, you would probably end up with part 1 on sacrifices. That's chapters 1 through 7. It's all about how to kill things and what to do with the blood and how to offer the sacrifices on the altar. Part 2 is what we did last week. That's the inauguration of the priesthood, chapters 8 through 10. And then today we begin part 3, which you might call the purity code, which goes from chapters 11 through 15. And the purity code is all about how do people of God remain pure. And when they become impure, how do they become pure again? What kinds of things defile a person? What kinds of things cut a person off from God in a ritual sense? And we'll spend 3 weeks during the purity code. This week we're only going to go through 1 chapter, which hopefully will be a blessing after doing 3 chapters last week. And then we'll do the other 4 chapters over 2 weeks in the coming weeks. So today we begin in chapter 11. What I want to do this morning is I want to fast forward to the end of the chapter and see where everything sort of lands and how the chapter comes to a head. And we'll talk about that, and then we'll back up to the beginning of the chapter and work our way through it. But Leviticus chapter 11, beginning in verse 46. These are the instructions regarding land animals, birds, marine creatures, and animals that scurry along the ground. By these instructions you will know what is unclean and clean, and which animals may be eaten, and which may not be eaten. Chapter 11 is all about animals. And it's about animals that are clean and animals that are unclean. Now the word clean is sort of a relative term. It changes meaning depending on the scenario where it's being used. So a referee might tell a boxer that he wants a good, clean fight. Well, the fight might get a little dirty. There might be blood, there might be sweat, but the fight is clean if there are no hits below the belt, if nobody's cheating. It's free of corruption, not dirt and grime. A mechanic might use some kind of industrial soap to get the grease off his hands so his hands are clean for supper. But take those same hands and put them into an operating room, and they're not considered clean. Because what's clean in an operating room and what's clean in a body shop are 2 totally different things. 2 years ago, I had a certain standard for what a clean household was. But now I have a toddler, and clean is something else now. So clean changes meaning depending on kind of where and how it's being used. And when we come to the book of Leviticus, clean means something unique. It doesn't have anything to do with dirt or grime or bacteria. It doesn't have to do with corruption. It has to do with acceptability. If an animal is clean, it means that animal is acceptable for the people of God to eat. And if an animal is unclean, then it is unacceptable for the people of God to eat this kind of meat. Which is kind of strange for us, because in our day, in our world, we don't have clean and unclean foods. We just have, all foods are clean. If you want to eat it, go for it. If you want to eat turkey, go for it. If you want to have a Big Mac, go for it. If you want to have a McRib or something, that's fine. If you want to have, a fried spider, it's a little weird, but okay. We don't have clean and unclean foods. So chicken, Kobe beef, artificial sweeteners even, it's all acceptable. It's all clean. But not so in the Jewish mind. In the Jewish mind, you have foods that are clean and foods that are not acceptable. And I think the closest that we can get to understanding that is perhaps being on a diet. When you're on a diet, you have foods that you're allowed to eat and foods you're not allowed to eat. You have to start looking at donuts and Kit Kats as like fat pills that I can't eat these. I always like to say, if a food makes me happy, I can't eat it. And if a food makes me sad, then it's okay. And that's how I know whether something's approved or unapproved. I think that's about as close as we can get to understanding clean and unclean foods. Except for the people of God, when they read chapter 11 of Leviticus, it's not that these foods are healthy or these foods are unhealthy. And it's not, these foods tend to be dirtier, or the animal tends to be dirtier than the other animals. It's just these foods are acceptable, these foods aren't, and it's at the discretion of God which ones are in which list. So that raises the question, what happens if you eat an animal that's on the unapproved foods list? Well, if you eat an animal that is unclean, then you yourself become unclean. Or the Hebrew word is tamah. I hear you say tamah. Okay, you become tamah. And when you're unclean, you are isolated from the community. That means you're not allowed to buy and sell. You're not allowed to go home. You're not allowed to touch anybody because the community has to remain pure. And so when you become impure, you have to be segregated from everybody else for as long as you are unclean. And it's not that we don't like you. It's not that, that you've done something terrible. It's just the community has to be pure. And so when you're pure, you're welcome back. It's a really big deal, actually, if you end up being unclean. And the purity code is all about how you become unclean and how you clean yourself when you are unclean. And in chapter 11, it's all about becoming unclean through food. So, if we were to back up to the beginning of the chapter, Leviticus 11, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. Of all the land animals, these are the ones you may use for food. You may eat any animal that has completely split hooves and choose the cud." So for an animal to be clean, if it's a land animal, it has to meet two criteria. It has to have what? Totally split hooves, and it has to chew the cud. Okay, what we're about to witness is the birth of Venn diagramming. With the two overlapping circles. You remember this from like middle school? One side chewing the cud, one side having split hooves, and where they overlap, those animals are clean. And the reason this is where someone invented Venn diagramming is because without it, you get Leviticus 11, which is just a list of animals that are unclean and animals that are clean. So, verse 4, "You may not, however, eat the following animals that have split hooves or that chew the cud, but not both," because you have to have both. "The camel chews the cud, but does not have split hooves, so it's ceremonially unclean for you." I don't know if you've ever seen a camel, but it's not that appealing to begin with. So thanks God that I really don't need you to tell me not to eat a camel. I got it. Verse 5, "The hyrax chews the cud, but does not have split hooves, so it's unclean." Which I know is a sorry loss, because that's no more hyrax burgers, no more smoked hyrax. When you go out to the Bounty for lunch later, you're not allowed, you can't get the hyrax platter. I don't know what it is. I think it's like a badger or something. Verse 6, "The hare chews the cud, but does not have split hooves, so it is unclean." The hare, the wascally wabbit. Actually, the rabbit brings an interesting thought to the table. When I say chew the cud, what do you think of? Probably a cow, right? A cow chews, and then it swallows and digests, and then regurgitates its food back into its mouth, delicious, swallows it again to a different stomach, rinse and repeat about 4 times. That's chewing the cud. Rabbits don't do that. And yet verse 6 says the rabbit chews the cud. So what does that mean then, to chew the cud? Well, remember that Leviticus was originally written in Hebrew. We just have an English translation of that. And in Hebrew, there's just one word. It's not one word for chew and another word for the and another word for cud. It's just one word, that chew the cud. And this is the only place where it's used. You can't go anywhere else in the Old Testament or any of the other ancient literature and figure out what does this word mean. And we don't have an ancient Hebrew dictionary that dates back 3,500 years to look up what this word means. So all we have is we have to figure out from context what each word means. And when it comes to this one, we don't have a whole bunch of context, so we just kind of have to stab in the dark. And chewing the cud is about as close as we've gotten. We know it has something to do with chewing. The problem is rabbits don't chew the cud. So people have begun to ask, what does it mean to chew the cud? What does this Hebrew word mean? One theory is that perhaps what it means is to eat food that's already been digested. Because rabbits have been known to eat their own droppings which again is delicious. And I'm so glad I get to talk on this. Next week's going to be even more exciting. But perhaps it means eating food that's already been digested. There's a word for that I asked Ben, and I don't remember what it is. A ruminant? Something like that. I don't know, I'm not a biologist. Some have suggested that perhaps it has to do with how long the animal chews. Because if you ever watch a cow, it just seems like they're just chewing, and they never take another bite. So perhaps chewing the cud, really what the word means is chewing for a long time. Others have said perhaps it's the motion of the jaw, that instead of a hinge-like chomping motion, that maybe it's a circular grinding motion of the jaw. Maybe that's what chewing the cud means. But whatever it is, camels do it, and hyraxes do it, and hares do it, but the pig doesn't. Verse 7, the pig has evenly split hooves, but it does not chew the cud. All the other animals were the opposite. The pig has split hooves, but it doesn't chew the cud, so it's unclean. You may not eat the meat of these animals or even touch their carcasses. They're ceremonially unclean for you. You don't get to eat the meat from the pig. Do you realize how devastating that is? No bacon. Just let that sink in. No bacon. No pork tenderloin. And you can't touch the carcasses. That means you can't touch a pigskin, which means you can't play football. No football. What kind of cruel God would take away bacon and football in one foul swoop? But there it is. Leviticus 11:8. So those are the land animals. You have to meet these two criteria. One, chewing the cud. The other, having split hooves. If it has one criteria but not the other, it's unclean. It has to have both. Verse 9. Of all the marine animals, these are the ones you may use for food. You may eat anything from the water if it has both fins and scales, whether taken from salt water or from streams. So again, Venn diagram. You have to meet two criteria. It has to have both fins and scales. Okay, wherever those two overlap, the animal is acceptable, and you can eat it. Verse 10. You must never eat animals from the sea or from rivers that do not have both fins and scales. They're detestable to you. This applies both to little creatures that live in shallow water and to all creatures that live in deep water. They will always be detestable to you. You must never eat their meat or even touch their dead bodies. Any marine animal that does not have both fins and scales is detestable to you. So, shrimp is unclean. Lobster, unclean. Eel, shellfish, oysters, all unclean. Trout and salmon, those are okay. Fins and scales, they got them both. But no shrimp. Now, verse 13. These are the birds that are detestable to you. So we've looked at land animals, we looked at sea animals, now we turn to birds. And with birds, you don't have a Venn diagram. You just have a list of birds that are off limits. And thank goodness, chicken is not on the list. You must never eat them. The griffin vulture, the bearded vulture, the black vulture, the kite, falcons of all kinds, ravens of all kinds, the eagle owl, the short-eared owl, the seagull, hawks of all kinds, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the barn owl, the desert owl, the Egyptian vulture, the stork, herons of all kinds, the hoopoe, and the bat. Those are the birds that you're not allowed to. So, no barn owl. Sorry. If you have any in your freezer, get rid of it, I guess. But chicken, turkey, those are both okay, which thank goodness, for me at least. Verse 20. You must not eat winged insects that walk along the ground. Oh, darn. They are detestable to you. You may, however, eat winged insects that walk along the ground and have jointed legs so they can jump, which thank goodness that we get some insects back. The insects you are permitted to eat include all kinds of locusts, bald locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers. All other winged insects that walk along the ground are detestable to you. So, ants, the chocolate-covered ants, those are unclean. But grasshoppers, those are good. So actually, John the Baptist. Sorry, now I'm just picturing a giant locust walking through the... Okay. John the Baptist eats locusts. Why? They're clean. They're one of the only insects that are clean. Verse 24. The following creatures will make you ceremonially unclean. If any of you touch their carcasses, you'll be defiled until evening. If you pick up their carcasses, you must wash your clothes, and you'll remain defiled until evening. Any animal that has split hooves that are not evenly divided or that does not chew the cud will be unclean for you. Yeah, we know that. We got that at the beginning of the chapter. If you touch the carcass of such an animal, you'll be defiled. Of all the animals that walk on all fours, those that have paws are unclean. So puppy dogs and kitty cats and monkeys and bears, and that's all I can think of. But bear meat in our country is kind of popular, just saying. But it's hell meat. Where was I? If you touch the carcass of such an animal, you will be defiled until evening. Verse 28, if you pick up its carcass, you must wash your clothes, and you will remain defiled until evening. These animals are unclean for you. One last category. We've done land animals, marine animals, birds, insects, and paws. Now verse 29. Of all the small animals that scurry along the ground, these are unclean for you. The mole rat, the rat, large lizards of all kinds, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the common lizard, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. All these small animals are unclean for you. If you touch the dead body of such an animal, you will be defiled until evening. So no mole rats. You can't have mole rat burgers. And if you have any recipes that call for chameleon, you're going to have to get the imitation chameleon extract. I just imagine the Hebrew people walking through the marketplace asking for imitation chameleon extract. I don't think they had that, but the chameleon was unclean. Now it gets kind of interesting, as much as it can get interesting in a chapter like this. Verse 32, if such an animal dies and falls on something, that object will be unclean. This is true whether the object is made of wood, cloth, leather, or burlap. Whatever its use, you must dip it in water, and it will remain defiled until evening. After that, it will be ceremonially clean and may be used again. So what we just read is that you come home to find that your pet camel has died and is rotting on your favorite t-shirt. And all you have to do is just dip it in water and it'll be fine. Don't worry about soap. Don't worry about detergent. Just dip it in water and it's good to go that evening. Verse 33, if such an animal falls into a clay pot, everything in the pot will be defiled, and the pot must be smashed. I don't know how often that would have happened that a gecko dies, falls off a shelf into your water pot, and knocks the pot over. But apparently it was a very common problem. If the water from such a container spills on any food, the food will be defiled, and any beverage in such a container will be defiled. Any object on which the carcass of an animal falls will be defiled. If it's an oven or hearth, it must be destroyed, for it's defiled, and you must treat it accordingly. However, if the carcass of such an animal falls into a spring or cistern, the water will still be clean, because it's being constantly replenished. But anyone who touches the carcass to get it out of the well or the river will become defiled. If the carcass falls onto seed grain to be planted in the field, the seed will still be considered clean. But if the seed is wet when the carcass falls on it, then the seed's defiled. So we'll stop there. What we've just seen is this giant list of all these animals that are acceptable to eat and touch, and all these animals that are unacceptable to eat and touch, or at least touch the carcass of. You can still ride a camel, it's just when it dies that you can't touch it. And then all the things that happen if the carcass were to touch something in your house, how would you handle that? One of the things that brought me to an absolute dead standstill in studying this chapter was the question of why. Why are these animals clean and those are unclean? Why did God set the criteria that he did? For example, land animals has to chew the cud and have split hooves. Well, why those? Why not if it has fur and a tail? Then it's clean. Like what is it about chewing the cud and split hooves that makes an animal so great? That I found, the more I dug into that question, I found that whenever you have 10 scholars in a room, you have about 12 opinions as to why. And actually, there are only about a dozen answers that have gained any real traction over the last several decades. I'll just show you a couple of them. One is the arbitrary theory. This is the idea that there is no rhyme, there's no reason. You don't get to know why God set the criteria He did. It's just there to see if you'll do it, just to test your obedience. The pagan worship theory, which is the theory that the unclean animals were associated with worship in Egypt, and so as God is drawing His people away from cultic worship, that He's drawing them away from these animals as well. The idea of symbolism is the idea that a land animal has to chew the cud, and this is a picture of the Christian, that we should always be ruminating on the Word of God, and that they should have a split hoof, the way that the Christian is supposed to walk in a way that's separate from the world. We're supposed to walk divided. Okay, that's the symbolism idea. Self-control, very much like the arbitrary theory, it's the idea that God just made these criteria, not a whole lot of rhyme or reason, but He establishes these criteria to teach you self-control, to teach you to say no when the world is saying yes. Everybody else eats bacon, but we don't eat bacon because we need to learn self-control. My favorite is the gross theory. The animals that are unclean because, have you ever seen a camel? Disgusting. The anomaly theory, this is one that came out just recently. It's the idea that you have these two criteria that define what an animal is supposed to be like, as if that's what God wants for all of creation. And any animal that doesn't fit into both categories is an anomaly of creation. Which, okay, that's great, but that doesn't explain why these criteria and not others. The idea of reverence for life, that God essentially has created arbitrary criteria just to put some animals on the do not eat list, to teach us that we can't just kill and eat whatever we want. That we need to have a reverence for all of life, not just human life, but even God's furry little creations we need to have a reverence for. The idea of the economy, that perhaps the birds are all birds of prey, and so they are eating meat and we are trying to eat meat, and so why there's some kind of conflict there, which that one doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And then finally, probably the most popular is the hygiene theory, which is the theory that the animals that are unclean are more likely to carry disease. And so God is, in a sense, protecting the health of His people by putting these animals on the unclean list. My question then is, why are poisonous plants not on the list? If God is looking out for the health of His people, why not put poisonous plants on the list? In fact, you'll notice that there were no plants at all in chapter 11. It's all meat. There's no fruits, veggies, grains, grass, weeds, anything like that. It's all animals.
It's like God's still picking on Cain, not Abel.
God's still picking on Cain. But you have these. If you were to go back to Genesis, the account of creation, when God creates mankind, He gives them every green plant for food. And so every plant is clean. Not all plants are good for you, but it's not about what's good for you, it's about what's acceptable and unacceptable. So you have all these plants. Also, if God is looking out for the health of His people, then why is it when Jesus comes, He would declare all foods clean? It's almost like God would be saying, I don't care about your health anymore. So I just have a couple of problems with that. The earliest theory to come up was the arbitrary theory. It was first posed by a Jewish rabbi named Eliezer ben Azariah, who taught between the years 70 and 100 AD, just after the fall of the temple in Jerusalem, about 50 years after the time of Jesus. He's a contemporary of the books of Matthew and Luke and John, Revelation, a couple of the letters, so he's living and teaching at the same time as much of the New Testament. And he posed the arbitrary theory. He was the first one to say, well, why does God tell us that an animal has to have split hooves and chew the cud? Well, there is no rhyme, there's no reason, it's just there to make sure that you obey Him. He just came up with a mindless rule for you to follow, just to teach you to follow him. That's around the year 70 AD. Well, Leviticus first came around in about the year 1450 BC. That's a difference of 1,500 years. That means for 1,500 years, people looked at Leviticus 11, and they followed Leviticus 11, and they ate kosher, and nobody asked why. That means that during the life of Jesus, nobody bothered to ask why hooves and fins and scales. Nobody seemed to be bothered by it. And what that means for us is that you can peruse the Bible all you want, you can make educated guesses and conjecture all you want, but ultimately, the Bible doesn't tell us why these criteria and not others. But what we can do is look at the effects of people following these laws and see how, as people did Leviticus 11, what happened? As people ate kosher, what happened? And as we dig into that, I think that a whole world of teaching will open up to us. So, back into the text, if we were to skip down to verse 43, it's not where we left off, but we'll skip down there. Verse 43, it says, "Do not defile yourselves by touching them. You must not make yourselves ceremonially unclean because of them. For I am the Lord, your God. You must consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. So do not defile yourselves with any of these small animals that scurry along the ground. For I, the Lord, am the one who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, that I might be your God. Therefore you must be holy, because I am holy." One of the effects of people eating kosher is that it made them holy. Holy is just a fancy church word for set aside as special or unique. Something being pulled off the assembly line because this one's particularly pretty and I like it. So it's different. It's not the same as everything else. And God says, I am holy. I'm different. I'm unique. I'm not like all those other gods. And so you, as my people, you need to be holy. You need to be different from all the other people. This nation needs to be different. And so as people ate kosher, kosher set Israel apart from all other nations. As the Hebrew people would walk through the marketplace asking for their chameleon extract, their imitation chameleon extract, people would look at them and say, there goes that family that doesn't eat bacon because of their religion. See, now that's the problem with religion. It made them different, noticeably different from the world around them. How many of you have ever been to Walmart and seen a family where all of the women were wearing floor-length plain dresses and bonnets? Maybe you know what I'm talking about. Sure. And what's the first thing that goes through your mind when you see them? There goes the family that dresses that way because of their religion. And it's not to say that the clothing is this way or that way, or that it's here or there. It's just to say when you see them, the practice of their faith sets them apart from other people. You know that they're different. It's the same way with kosher. When people ate kosher, it made them different from the people around them. It made them holy. And so people would look at the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, and say, that nation isn't like everybody else. As other nations would read through Leviticus 11, they would not say, oh, don't eat camel. Well, of course, well, nobody eats camel. No, people ate camel. When your camel dies, you make use of it. Nobody would read through this and say, well, of course. Instead, they read through it and they say, why on earth would your God take away bacon and football? Your God, what on earth is going on here? You're so different. So, one big effect is that it sets the people of Israel apart from everybody else. While I was growing up, our church would take trips to international mission trips, and we did this every year, and I got to be a part of this group several times. One year, the leader of our group had never been to the particular culture we were entering, and he knew that when we got there, they weren't going to be serving us cheeseburgers and corn dogs, but he didn't know what they were going to serve us. And so, one night for our training night, we had a cuisine night, where he went out to the international market, got a bunch of foods that we weren't used to, came back, prepared it, and we just had a meal of all these kind of strange foods and juices that we weren't used to. Things that you can't just go to Walmart and pick up a jug of. I remember there was one pan that was filled with this kind of fluffy, sort of slimy mass that was green, like lime green. And we had no idea what it was, and he wouldn't tell us what it was. He just said, you don't get to know, eat it. Because when you get there, you're just going to have to eat whatever they give you. And one of the girls who was on the team ate a couple of bites of this food and was so disgusted by it that she lost her lunch. And then we found out it was scrambled eggs with green food coloring. And so it was just the mental, the idea of I don't know what I'm eating and the texture is really weird. But if she had known, it would have been okay. Well, when we got to this culture, we found out the food is not as strange as we were expecting. Every day for lunch, we had rice and beans and fried plantains. It was like the staple of the meal. Every morning for breakfast, it was watermelon and mango. A couple of times we got to have bananas. We only had meat 3 or 4 times in those 8 days. We only had ice in our drinks once. Every other time it was either hot coffee or lukewarm water. It was just something we had to get used to. I went to another culture once where hard-boiled eggs were the staple for breakfast. I mean, that's what everybody has for breakfast. And there is no like milk and cereal. If there is milk and cereal, the milk is lukewarm, which, try that this week. It's terrible. But for 2 weeks, we didn't have any cold drinks, any cold food. Everything was hot all the time, which that actually gets really old after a while. And it was just a very different kind of culture. You see, culture is made up of a variety of things. Transportation. As you go around the world, people don't all drive the same kinds of things that we drive. As you go to Europe, there's a lot more buses. As you go into the Caribbean, a lot of people use mopeds. In the East, people use bicycles a lot. Trains are very popular. So transportation changes between culture. Art changes. Clothing, music, language. These are all things that change. And cuisine is one of the things that helps define a culture. And so fried plantains and rice and beans are a staple in the Dominican Republic. And hard-boiled eggs are a staple in Palestine. And gumbo comes from New Orleans. And sauerkraut makes me think of Germany. And in the US, we have cheeseburgers and fries, which, good job, us. It's a great American meal. So what happens when Jews would eat kosher, according to Leviticus 11, is it gave them this cultural cuisine wherever they went. These foods I eat, these foods I don't eat. And so it doesn't matter where they are. It creates this sense of culture that transcends culture. It gives them a sense of identity that transcends wherever they are. They have a sense of community that's not tied to a particular place or time. So if you go to France and you only eat kosher, you might be in the world, you might be submerged into this culture, and yet you maintain who you are through your cuisine. You can go to Chile, and it's the same thing. South Africa, and it's the same thing. Poncha Springs, wherever you are, when you eat this way, you maintain your identity. Because their identity was not tied, their culture was not tied to a document or a flag or a style of art or a style of writing or language. It was tied to something like how they eat. Now you think about this. How many people in our country would fight and die to protect the Constitution of the United States? Several. I mean, the Secret Service agents are sworn in to protect not the president, but the Constitution. And if the president poses a threat to the Constitution, they will assassinate him. Because their sworn duty is to protect this document. So why is it when someone poses, maybe we should reform or maybe we should amend the Constitution, people go absolutely crazy? Because our identity is tied to a document. If you change what the Constitution says, you're in effect changing what it means to be American. Correct? And so our identity is tied to this piece of paper. Well, for them, their identity wasn't tied to a piece of paper or to Leviticus as much as it was tied to, this is how I eat, and this is how I farm, and this is how I treat my neighbor, and this is how I dress. And it's something I take with me no matter where I am. You see, if we leave the United States, we leave the Constitution behind. But when they leave their country, they take their cuisine with them. And so it creates this sense of culture that transcends culture. Now, one of the things that makes Leviticus really hard to talk about in a setting like this is that as Christians we have this sort of knee-jerk response that we want to jump right to the New Testament and talk about Leviticus through the lens of the New Testament. I consulted at least a dozen commentaries trying to figure out what on earth does this have to say to the modern Christian. And no one was able to talk about it without saying, well, you know, in Mark 7, Jesus declares all foods are clean, and so these laws don't apply. But we can go ahead and look at them as sort of an academic exercise. But just remember, they don't teach anything, they don't apply anything to us today. That's how they all landed. That's not where I want to land today. Because I believe that Leviticus has something meaningful to teach us on its own, in its own right. So I don't want to go somewhere else and say, well, this is what gives meaning to the chapter. I just want to prop Leviticus up and say, this is what Leviticus teaches us. So one of the things that we learn out of this chapter of Leviticus is that God's people are supposed to be set apart. If nothing else, we can get this, that God's people are supposed to be set apart from all other people. We walk in a way that's different. Now, this hasn't always been the case with us. We've asked for a king so that we would be like the nations around us. We've turned to worship the gods of the nations around us, and we've assimilated to the cultures around us. Even today, we continue to chase things that the world around us chases: success, retirement, the white picket fence, a number on the scale, financial security, power. We want the same things that the people around us want. And yet God is calling us to be set apart. It's almost like we know that God wants us to be different from everybody else. We just want to stick out as little as possible. And yet there's Leviticus 11 calling us to be different from everybody else, to be holy because He is holy. The second thing that I think Leviticus has to teach us, and we'll close with this, is that God's people transcend time and space. The first year that I was in the Dominican Republic, it was about the fourth day or so, Sunday rolled around, and we had our breakfast, and then we put all the tables off to the side, and we stacked probably 50 of the stackable white lawn chairs. We set them up much like this, and about 30 Dominicans came from the village, and there were about 20 of us. And the Dominicans all sat on this side, and the Americans all sat on this side. And so there was a very clear visual difference between brown skin and white skin. But before the service started, several of the teenagers got up and went and sat with the Dominicans. And several of the Dominican orphans got up and sat on the laps of these white American parents. And before long, there wasn't a division of color. We had two song leaders that morning, one who would sing in English and one who would sing in Spanish, and they would go back and forth. And whenever we were singing in Spanish, the Dominicans would giggle at us gringos for trying to mumble our way through the Spanish. And when we would sing a song in American or in English, we would kind of chuckle at them as they had a very thick Spanish accent. And yet we were singing the same song. When the sermon was given, I think it was one of us that got up to speak, and then there was the only Dominican there who knew English would translate. So you'd hear a sentence in English, and then it'd get repeated in Spanish, back and forth. So a 20-minute lesson becomes a 40-minute lesson. And then we did the Lord's Supper. And the tray just went back and forth across the aisle. And there was no distinction. Food brought us together. Food was a way of uniting people who worship in Spanish and people who worship in English. And that was the very first time that I realized these people worship the same God that I worship. See, I thought God was back home in Kansas City. I thought that's where He gets worshipped. And so I didn't really know what to expect here. And yet here, they're worshiping the same God. And they're performing the same rituals. And they're eating the same food. I think they even had Welch's. I mean, it was so the same. God's people are not confined to a particular place, to a particular time or hour of the week. They're not conformed to one particular expression or language or style of clothing. But instead, God's people form this mysterious kingdom that transcends culture, that transcends time and place. So may you realize that you are part of a mysterious kingdom that transcends where you are and what language you speak. May you walk in a way that is divided from the world. May you be holy because He is holy.